Biodynamics, Agriculture of the Future. Copyright 2000 by Alex Podolinsky. All rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced, stored in retrieval systems, or transmitted in any form, unless prior written permission from the publisher. Audio production by Mark Rathbone, 2025. Considering this lecture happened in 1999, some of the farmers and organisations mentioned may not be still in operation. In this lecture, Alex Podolinsky demystifies the activity of biodynamic preparations and shows how the effectiveness of such preparations in soil development and plant form is easily seen. This lecture complements the Biodynamic Agriculture Introductory Lecture Series, wherein fundamentals of the biodynamic agricultural method are discussed in a down-to-earth and practical manner. The lecture was translated from the German presentation to the Demeter International Organization and has been lightly edited so that the quality of the spoken word has been retained. Experience has shown that for an introduction to the effective practice of the biodynamic method, direct instruction and initial supervision is necessary. In Australia, a wide-ranging advisory service, the Biodynamic Agricultural Association of Australia, has developed for this purpose. Biodynamics, Agriculture of the Future. Demeter International Lecture, held at Latina, Italy, June 1999. The farmer who today desires to convert to organics or biodynamics faces far greater difficulties than 30 or 40 years ago. For one, soils are sicker. Here is a picture, so if you get time to have a look at this, of a typical lump of soil from Agri-Latina neighbours, and it is audibly hard, as if one was knocking on wood. Even in the Ukraine, the United States, Egypt or Australia, and as shown here in Europe soils, they come up in such hard lumps. Furthermore, there are climatic difficulties. In a recent lecture, 1997, published in English, I give reasons for the increasingly venomous storms, the enormous floodings, and the incredibly gigantic hail. All this makes farming difficult. 5,000 pigeons were released in France. They were to home in England. None found home. In Australia, a pigeon has landed on Macquarie Island, thousands of kilometres from the Australian mainland, where it arrived deadly exhausted. It could not find home because communications functioning via satellites so disturbed the atmosphere that the pigeons were misdirected. This is also a contributory reason for the many nervous children and affected adults. A new, not recognised form of pollution, of which possible effects on nature generally have not been investigated. Additionally, there is the commercial situation of farmers often oppressed by banks, the commercial influence of multinationals and governments inclusive of bureaucracy. They actually would like to be rid of us, namely the organic biodynamic integrity and product purity. They want to replace us with what in Europe is called integrated agriculture, clean and green with us, and which permits inputs of minimum chemicals. Such production, easier and cheaper to achieve, is to be certified and accredited and will be available in supermarkets at a lower cost than our honest production, so that it is made difficult for us to compete. All such can be expected. In the EU, there is furthermore satellite monitoring of every square metre and the influence thereupon of Brussels, subsidy-based, which robs farmers of making individual sound farming decisions. For instance, soils have to be ploughed under atrociously wet conditions, or the farmer would lose the right to cultivate this acreage for all future. Much too steep hills are cropped with sunflowers because of the extra $1,500 per hectare subsidy so gained, with horrendous erosion resulting. It would take too long to discuss the weather situation referred to earlier. However, it can be clearly shown that Earth has asthma. An asthma sufferer can breathe in, whereas there is difficulty with breathing out. Earth is exactly in this situation. The overall process of degradation began when Justus von Liebig, who, interestingly, towards the end of his life was not in full agreement with what his work tended towards in the hands of others, discovered that plants can take in minerals only when soluble. Therewith began the artificial fertilizer industry. And in the first lecture of Volume 1 of my Biodynamic Agricultural Introductory Lectures, I demonstrate how plants should actually be nourished. I cannot expect that many of this audience have read this, so I shall briefly repeat it, as it builds the foundation of the following contents. Steiner's agricultural lectures contain an innocent sentence, of which little notice has been taken. It reads, "The plant should take in elements via humus and not through soil water." Here is a picture, so if you get time to have a look at this. This is called Figure 1. If we take this line as surface and we have a tree, and here we have humus indicated by the little plus signs, also roots, and the tree has leaves. As soon as the plant is in leaf, it has to transpire water. To allow this to happen, it must therefore take in water. This is akin to breathing with man. We must breathe in and out to remain alive. Thus the plant takes in water predominantly with vertical, darker roots. There are also the smaller, more horizontal white roots, which can be seen, for instance, late winter to early spring, when trees are taken from the nursery for planting. Then, even before bud swell, the white hair roots show up. These are the real feeder roots. The two root systems have generally not been distinguished. When using artificial fertilizer, say, nitrogen, powder is applied to the top of the soil. Rain dissolves the nitrogen into the soil. Then all the soil water, as far as the rain penetrated, is filled with nitrogen. If we colour the nitrogen with red dye, it is easy to observe. When in this scenario the plant takes in water for transpiration, it is forced to take in the red water. The plant is then nourished through the water and not through the humus. One may inquire how plants were fed before water-soluble fertilizers evolved. I have often been so questioned at the beginning of my work 50 years ago. The general acceptance, especially in phosphate-starved Australia, was that plants would not grow without fertilization. Little is considered that, prior to Justus von Liebig, artificial fertilizing only commenced on a wider scale after the First and, in particular, the Second World War. That prior to von Liebig, plants were nourished, even grew and produced quite well. Plants do require water-soluble elements. In nature, insoluble minerals occur in rock and are freed into solubility via chemical biological happenings. Worms and microbes function at the end of this chain of events. Minerals passing through their bodies will be embedded in humus in a water-soluble form. At no university or agricultural college have I ever seen humus like the 500 in my hand. But there are theories at such establishments as to how humus is to be taken up into the plant, and typically how parts of humus, for instance humic acid, are absorbed. In a preserving jar filled with humus and buried open a few inches under pasture in spring, the dark content will vanish totally in a matter of weeks and will be densely replaced with the said white hair roots, like a piston in a liner. Therefore, the entire humus substance is taken into the plants. At universities, there are also examinations of the metabolism of man, animals and plants. Once engaged in this process, examinations again tend into small and smaller particles. Thus, an important and principal difference in the metabolism of plants, man and animals is readily overlooked. Man and animals maintain an individual metabolism because each has an individual warmth organisation. Plants do not have an independent warmth organisation. A plant's metabolism is stimulated by sun's warmth. The white hair roots are activated by sun warmth. The plant is absolutely dependent on sun warmth to take in humus. Initially, the most important criteria of humus is that it is a colloid. This ball of humus in my hand contains water-soluble elements, mineral salts. If I place this humus substance into a glass full of water, it will be as it would be had I placed Swiss cheese into cold water. It would remain virtually unchanged for months, and the water-soluble minerals in the humus or cheese would not mix with the water because of the colloidality which encases the ball skin-like. Here in Figure 1, we have the red soluble nitrate water, and the plant, in taking up water, must take in the red nitrates. Here, the plus signs indicate humus and where it's located, is dispersed throughout the soil, and the white feeder roots enter the humus and take up water-soluble elements, but in this case, exactly as much as the sun warmth dictates or inspires. In the red water scenario, the plant must partake nitrogen without sun dictum. The plant must transpire when in leaf, whether it is cold or hot. This is the cardinal and fundamental point which has to be understood. Where the plant is forced to take in red water, it will take up much mineral salt. In each cell of our or a plant's body, an equilibrium of salt and water must exist. Where the cell's salt content is higher, sickness will occur. Plants, influenced by excessive nitrogen absorption, grow fast, are overgrown, blue-green and hang water-filled. Flying over Europe, much, ever still green wheat can be noticed lying flat. These are symptoms of over-fertilization. In organic agriculture, where animal manures are used, which have not been composted so that the entire heap is as colloidal as the 500 in my hand, the water-soluble salts remain free and would behave in soils so manured like the red water of artificial nitrogen fertilizer. On pastures around cow pads, grass and clover grows much larger. Animals are reluctant to graze this lush growth because cow manure also contains water-soluble NPK, and the resultant equally blue-green grass likewise contains nitrates and is bitter. This is a fundamental problem with organic, and often also of so-called biodynamic agriculture. Namely, the water-soluble salts enter the plants through organic fertilizers dissolved in soil water and not held in soil humus. In the plant, salt and water must be in balance. If the plant is filled excessively with salts, because manured artificially or because manured organically without understanding, then the following happens. All combustible plant substances derives from CO2 in the air, which was assimilated in the leaf. Much less of the plant's total substance is derived from earth. The greatest component is water. The second comes with photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is a major reason for plant transpiration. It functions via light cells, located mainly on tops of leaves, organized like a camera lens with a shutter, which are opened by transpiring water so that sunlight can be absorbed. Chlorophyll and starch are made. The leaf is the main metabolic organ of the plant. Even roots grow from the leaf. Starch turns into finest aromatic sugar and food substances, and on the other hand, also into wood. The plant transpires to gain finest substances. But when the plant is overfilled with salts, then the plant cells are likewise overfull with water to remain alive. This unnaturally large plant we have examined carefully transpires less water than the equally aged smaller natural plant nourished under the dictum of the sun. With unnatural salt absorption, each cell becomes an egoist and releases less water, so as not to be affected by saltation, and water movement within the plant is reduced. For this reason, less photosynthesis takes place in those blue-green giant plants, and they taste bitter. These are nitrogen salts. They do not have the fine flavours and nourishment value of sun-influenced natural plants. Approximately 45 years ago, I obtained understanding of these plant nourishment factors. In my work also with view to conventional agricultural experts, this was of fundamental importance. It provided a foundation of factual science, which is in no way mystical, but when properly understood, actually expresses the plant should be fed through humus and not through the soil water. Before we view some pictures to the general situation of soils and to what can be seen at Agri-Latina, a further fundamental reality has to be regarded. In Australia, we have very few real rivers. A real river such as Po, the Rhine, the Danube, show approximately 10% of the water associated with the particular river visibility in the river. 90% is hidden in a vein system extending far into the plain, from where the river draws water and even holds water back. An interesting process. In dry Australia, few rivers exist, but there are many dry riverbeds, and when, after 18 months or 2 years, rain breaks in dry areas, it can be 1 metre in 24 hours. Then dry riverbeds turn into flood channels, and soon after again are dry. Flood channels are not connected to the surrounding earth and have no vein system. I have read reports of floods of, for instance, the Danube, where, for many centuries, flood marks exist. In recent years, flooding has been higher by metres than ever before. The reason for this is that soils have turned into what I will now show. We have just visited Sicily and the Marche. The erosion problem is enormous, and it is astounding how virtually nothing is undertaken to make a halt to this in a practical, technical way. I had contact in Sicily with an EU-appointed agronomist who is to find a solution. He was helpful as an interpreter of a lecture and interested in my suggestions. We should have some pictures here which you can look at later at your convenience. The first pictures were taken in 1981-82 in a relatively good rainfall area of South Victoria, after a drought period of about 1.5 years and a gentle but persistent opening rain. Picture 1 shows a biodynamic farm, picture 2 a conventional neighbour. Similar symptoms can be seen in the comparison of Agri-Latina and a neighbour after heavy rain, pictures 3 and 4. And the French professional biodynamic vineyard and their neighbour, pictures 5, and then picture 6. Picture 7 shows the development of soil under biodynamic management from an original forest soil of picture 8. In each comparative case, the photographs were taken on the same day. In a differing example, soil destruction can be demonstrated in the cultivation results of pictures 9 and pictures 10. The soil here is a very rich Latina soil, which has been ruined by modern farm techniques and become structureless, akin to a cement road, which can only be cultivated with giant tractors pulling murderous, heavy-built ploughs. The same can be seen on all continents, including the Ukraine, and also on so-called organic and biodynamic farms. The enormous lumps are quickly broken down to sand powder with appropriate weapons so that seed beds are achieved and irrigation can take place. Year by year, the soil thus becomes more compacted. To open soil by cultivation and to allow time for soil fermentation has become forgotten. Humusless cement soils require, of needs, more artificial fertilizers each year and more irrigation because of lack of humus. Humus can hold water to 70% of its volume. And these unhealthy plantings, overfilled with salt and water, are attacked by innumerable pests, which, in natural environments, occur only in small numbers to deal with damaged or otherwise affected plant material, requiring increasingly amounts of venomous chemicals. If you refer to picture 11, taken after 3 months of no rain, it shows how deep black biodynamic soil has continuing pasture growth, whereas 20 metres away in picture 12, conventional soil and plants are under moisture stress. Please also pay attention to the colour variations between biodynamic and conventional soils, not just the darkness of the biodynamic soils, but how these glow and how the conventional soils show dull opaqueness. When an experienced physician sees such opaqueness in a stool, he questions liver function. One must objectively distinguish such colour variations in black or red volcanic and other soils. A comparison with the original colour of each soil should be sought. Vincent van Gogh painted soils as they should be, full of glow power. Agri-Latina biodynamically grown vegetables were examined with the biophoton method in comparison with similar organic vegetables. One was astonished regarding the rich light result. A biophoton test on vegetables assesses their quality, freshness, and potential contamination by measuring the faint light biophotons they naturally emit, which is linked to their internal energetic and metabolic state. This non-destructive method uses specialized equipment to detect subtle changes in biophoton patterns that indicate stress, injury, or spoilage, providing a real-time insight into the vegetable's overall health and nutritional value. If you get a chance, refer to Figure 2A, carrots, and Figure 2B, kohlrabi. Figure 2A, photon test comparing organic carrots with biodynamically grown carrots. The graph shows the organic carrots had a reading of just over 3,500, whereas the biodynamic carrots were up around 7,000. In Figure 2B, the biophoton result for organic kohlrabi was just over 10,000, but the biodynamically grown kohlrabi had a measurement of over 16,000. On the biodynamic farm depicted in picture 1, no artificial fertilizer had been applied for several decades, although the soil originally was poor sand. 3 years ago, agronomists from a fertilizer company collected clover leaves for leaf analysis purposes and discovered, to their astonishment, a full supply of all major and minor elements. The farm produces well, grains, cattle, sheep, and pigs. Everywhere where water runs off, causing erosion, or where soils are compacted as depicted, the soil hardly takes in water and the vein system of the river cannot function. An example of another kind should also be raised. An Australian 1,000 hectare farm, flat like a tabletop, with an approximately 6 metre deep gully creek running along one boundary, flanked by a road and a neighbouring conventional farm on the hillside above the road, with an owner in his mid-80s. In the past autumn, after the usual 6 to 8 months of dry spell, the old conventional farmer said, "Do you know what you are doing down there, John? In 80 years this creek, over summer and autumn, is running for the first time. Our biodynamic farm has developed sufficient humus and therewith stored water in the soil so that a vein system has commenced, which involves the entire district in a healing process. After these introductory considerations, I come to the actual theme, and I proceed, as always, with an observation which in turn must be brought to conceptual recognition. One cannot discuss agriculture without perceptions, which requires practical involvement. We are visited from around the world. Some are farmers, Chinese, Japanese, Europeans, Americans, and when I mention lectures and advisory activity by agronomists, to this multitude of farmers, all faces show a similar smile. They know that however knowledgeable these agronomists may be, they could not farm the land of the farmers. Namely, that there is no real practical experience. Like art critics who cannot paint. It is important to recognise this fundamentally because sadly, particularly in Europe, where peasant holdings were small and peasants worked hard and therefore were reluctant to talk much, however much they observed, and the studied talk much, the peasant was seen as silly. This is how it came about that agronomists became recognised as the professionals of agriculture and not the peasants. The real professional of agriculture, however, is the one who produces food akin to the artist painting pictures. Food that is nutritious and not poisoned. Unfortunately, due to the system of agricultural education establishments, the possibilities of practical experience for agricultural students is limited to short-term visitor status on a farm, where 30 are to perform the work of one person. Practical experience would have to endure for several years, inclusive of independent farm management, under common commercial pressures. Medical doctors would never accept to be represented by bureaucrats of the health ministry who never touch a patient. They represent themselves, as do teachers. In general science, especially so in conventional agricultural science, it is accepted that elements leaving the farm in products have to be replaced. Closed farm units are mentioned in most certification standards as a pious wish. When in the early days government agronomists brought up this theme, I raised the peasant production of centuries before Justus von Liebig. Peasants in my childhood used no artificial fertilizers and farm chemicals did not even exist. Artificial fertilizers were used on large estates with sandy soils. Closed farm units, as argument is true at the historic date, not so today. Earth's population is 4 times that of 1900. Today, in the developed nations, Italy, with 7% farm population, rates highest. In the United States, it is 3%, and in Australia, 4%. 70 years ago, the great majority lived in the country, as workers or as small consumers, purchasing milk, butter, even bread from peasants. Very little produce left peasant holdings. The economy of recycling was enormous. Nothing was wasted. Healthy storage prevailed. Every waste went into the underground pit. Very rich areas like the Ukraine served as the breadbasket of poorer countries. Today, the opposite exists. We are forced into agricultural factory production. If, also as biodynamic farmers, we recognise our duty to deliver healthy food to city children, then we require production units such as AgriLatina, 130,000 people fed by 90 to 100 workers. But these factory farms must function at least as perfectly as a small house garden. We are capable of achieving this on huge properties. For instance, in Australia, we spray 500 perfectly, not with planes, to 750 hectares per afternoon and early night. Today, a totally different situation faces us than 70 years ago. This also belongs to the introduction. Many people, even some from country areas, are supermarket orientated and do not know anymore how milk, a carrot, or potatoes should taste. Between 1900 and 1920, however, especially on large estates, artificial fertilizer had been used. Some noticed that potatoes and some other products no longer had taste. Such contacted Rudolf Steiner, who had already given new impulses in various areas. Steiner held back for years. Finally, Count Kieserling asked a burly nephew not to leave Steiner's doorstep until a meeting date was given. Steiner stood in the end phase of his work, and apart from the daily agricultural lectures, travelled to Breslau to hold another course each night. He was, as could be demonstrated, not certain in details of the agricultural course. However concise fundamental principles were expressed, you must try it out. Steiner had prescribed a far-flung university program for Onrad Pfeiffer and offered living quarters in his own house, eventually entrusted Pfeiffer with the development of the preparations, the making, storage, application, stirring, spraying. We followed this and exchanged preparations with Pfeiffer in the early 1950s. He was surprised that in Australia, especially our nettle preparation, which, after 1 year, is often difficult to discover, was better than his own. We had developed a special method for making this preparation, whereas in Germany, to a degree, a different path was chosen, and it was decided to dry the preparations and to thus store them. Pfeiffer, a most creative scientist, was, however, not a farmer, and not much developed farm-wise in the US. Biodynamic development, as in many countries, was limited more to the members of the Anthroposophic Society, whereas it was the wish of Steiner that biodynamics, as the modern method of agriculture, would come to wide general use. So, biodynamics commenced in response to the new agricultural difficulties. So-called organic agriculture started years later in England, guided by our friend Eve Balfour, Albert Howard, Albrecht, and others in the United States. The direction there was back to nature, akin to how all peasants in my childhood simply farmed naturally. But this organic beginning was at hands of people who did not earn their bread with personal physical hard work. Lady Eve appeared as the most conversant with farm work. However, never in life or in history can one look backwards and so hope to overcome new difficulties. One has to strive forwards. And I hope to now show how we move forwards. Here in my hand I hold Effective 500. It comes about by filling suitable cow manure into horns. Cow manure has a well-known scent, and this cow manure, buried over winter, becomes a substance, as is this 500. How does the 500 smell in comparison to the manure from which it stems? One actually has to push the nose right into the 500. Can one, with 500, recognize whence it originated? Joachim, a member of the audience, says no, he could not recognize where 500 came from. And Alex says, that is correct. What does this mean? I am looking for a conceptual conclusion. As stated, one cannot recognize where from 500 originated. According to the Gothianistic method, as organ of perception, we are not using eyes or ears, but the sense of smell. What concise word expression is there? Here is a cow manure substance, and here the 500 substance, and one cannot recognize from what the latter stems. One can certainly not recognize that 3 or 4 months ago it was cow manure, What does that mean in one word? When one cannot recognize the origin. Joachim answers, a transformation has taken place. Alex says, but into what? Some say 500 smells neutral. Joachim says yes. He agrees that it is neutral. If 500 is neutral, how then does this cotton wool smell? Cotton wool has no scent at all. One could also use the term neutral, but more accurate would be sterile. This is very important. So, this 500 is neutral. One also says transposed. Now, in this glass jar, I have a bomb. In it is similar 500, but held airtight by this lid for some weeks. Even those seated in the back will smell it. Alex opens the jar with gas audibly escaping. Well, how does it smell? Answer, sharp. No, I require an exact description of the smell. Answer, putrid, like rotten fish. Well, this was perfect 500. Therefore, because 500 is not neutral/sterile, but continues to exist as a living substance, although as a substance of undefinable origin, quite factually, a transubstantiation has taken place. In our stomach region, particularly in the small intestines, there is a white milky substance. Everything we consume should at some time be transformed into this substance. Otherwise, if I ate fish yesterday, I would have some fish here in my arm and here some salad, and I would slowly be poisoned. Pfeiffer, as a pioneer nutritionist, pointed this out. Therefore, what I consume must also be neutralized into a transformed substance. Before, out of this neutral substance, I can build up new body substance. We are dealing with something which, drawn graphically, has to be like this. When you get a chance, we've got a picture of this. Here, old substance enters. In the middle, there is a jump, and there emerges a new substance. It is the symbol of chaos. Rudolf Steiner also indicated that chaos exists not only in stirring, but likewise in the soil humus. Humus, humanus, human. Chaos is the activity toward new life. A preparation only then is such when it is transformed. In fact, when correctly understood, it is transubstantiated. It will become evident that only when this has happened, and furthermore, when it is kept alive in the same moist original condition, that only then is 500 fully effective. In the early years of biodynamic development, the agricultural course was not generally available. A lady in England was denied access. She therefore inserted the compost preparation flowers into compost in dried herb form. A slight effect resulted. It may be similar with dry or inferior preparations. A confrontational discussion whether moist or dry preparations should be used, as innocent and democratic as this may appear, is improper and hypothetical. It denies a priori transubstantiation and chaos and the life-essential moistness. We have another picture, picture 13, showing Australians transubstantiated preparations and some obtained in Sicily, which came from Central Europe. None of the European preparations were transformed, never transubstantiated. The origin of each, including 500, was perceived readily. The dandelion preparation consists of seed head puff, bottom left, which is not transformable. These flowers were picked at a wrong time. The dandelion and chamomile preparations in particular showed mouldiness. The horn manure was pressed and smeared on the outside into a ball, limiting air uptake and allowed to eventually dry out. On the outside, mould was noticeable to eye and nose. Inside, the ball showed light green manure by eye and scent, which stemmed either from not fully converted manure when horns were taken out or developed in the ball due to lack of air. Unfortunately, there are, today, many foods prepared akin to soluble manure, i.e., they are readily available and avoid neutralization. That is the preparatory reason towards sickness. In the soil, the humus substance is of similar purpose in purification as the milky substance in a healthy man's digestion. Free nurturing. The plant is to take in not too little or too much, but what is decreed by sun warmth direction. Then it has the right flavour. Furthermore, if it partakes via humus, then it is not poisoned through old substance. A new reason for eating biodynamic foods, and that purity of food is an all-encompassing necessity. That is the most important function of humus, followed by the colloidality, which holds water-soluble elements. Transubstantiated humus enables the plant to have individual existence. Years earlier, I was informed of the Swiss comparative trials conducted by the Feeble Research Organization. Conventional with stable manure, organic, biodynamic, and entirely natural without any manuring. I heard that after 14 years, hardly a result for biodynamics was discernible, and I intended to find out the reasons. Susanna Kaufer accompanied me to the research farm and institute and was present throughout. I report only on essentials for this lecture. First, we visited the trial plots and, at the time of year, I could discern no difference between the organic and biodynamic plots. We then visited the responsible scientists. After some time, it emerged that these scientists also could not see any special results in the biodynamic plot, and that they were consequently rather inclined to the organic method. They seemed to doubt Australian pictures on one-year biodynamic conversion results, regarding the slight biodynamic results after 14 years. Claimed with the chromatography method, I felt somewhat ashamed, as this more anthroposophic method is not generally recognised, and as no results were discernible in the soil of the field plots or in the plants. I requested to see the preparations used. At the Institute, only 500 was stored. Other preparations were supplied by peasants. The 500 stored at the Feeble Institute was similar to the stinking bomb we talked about earlier, stored in a tightly screwed down large jar, in a box with a few centimetres of peat moss, which barely came up the sides beyond the bottom. When I demonstrated the stink, I was informed that the 500 came from the Gothianum. Equal begets equal. I cannot know the condition in which this 500 arrived from the Gothianum, although, over the decades, we have variably witnessed 2 wet 500 there. But this example amplifies why the Australian Demeter standards have strict requirements on the storage of preparations, as is known by Michael Reitveld. This is not a case of denial of freedom, but concerns professional ethics, as Herr Allenberg of Walleda expressed in response to an earlier lecture of mine. It is expected professionally from a surgeon that he operates with sterilised utensils and not with soiled scalpels. The stinking 500 would not lift but lower the soil. Each preparation is such only when it is transubstantiated, typically for the particular preparation. If 500 is stored as in this jar, what does it smell like? Answer, musty. Yes, it is mouldy, dried out, like the Central European 500 ball. When 500 is stored airtight, it stinks and is counterproductive. Dried out, it is similarly ineffective. On the outside, it is mouldy, and inside, it again reverts towards green manure. 500 and the preparations are effective when appropriately transubstantiated and when applied at the correct spring or autumn time, and when correctly stored in peat moss and protected from outside influences such as electricity, petrol fumes, satellites, etc., and held in the same state of moistness in which they arose from the soil, each with its special scent. The principle and the purpose of the associated transubstantiation is a reality, open to the cognition power of any individual. It is not a matter of opinion. Therewith, the preparations must be recognized and termed as sacraments, the only sacraments available to objective cognition reality. The effectiveness of such preparations in soil development and plant form is easily seen. The preparations are not medicines. That would be a total misunderstanding. They are builders of a new nature. Biodynamic practicants are builders of health, not healers of sickness. I feel for medicos who have to be concerned with sickness and often have a hankering for the land, and am grateful for our task. We are therewith artists in the reality of nature, not musicians in a soul realm. Here we have some more pictures. Soil picture 14 shows a very compacted sandy clay loam, and in picture 15, the same soil 1 year later. The soil in 14 is inaccessible to air. One can ask regarding the most important soil ingredient for soil to be alive. Some answer water. In fact, it is air. If in the soil of picture 14 air is hindered, the soil cannot function and 500 would not become effective. This soil therefore was ripped once, sprayed twice with 500, and some pasture seeds were roughly applied. The difference in colour, in power of glow, and in structure is readily noticed. From what stems all the dark substance in the soil of picture 15? What is it made of? The conventional answer is converted organic substance of the original soil of picture 14. But look, where in this original soil is there any organic substance to be found? On top, sparse weeds, hardly a root, and heavy compaction. This transformation in 1 year. Here at Agri-Latina, there were similar results, even after 8 months, achieved initially with the Australian preparations and appropriate cultivation. Where from does this dark substance derive? Pfeiffer unfortunately did not complete the answer I will refer to, namely, Pfeiffer, a very clever bacteriologist, as we heard, discovered bacteria in the preparations, one specialising in chewing up paper, which did not exist beforehand in nature. In Lysenko's opinion, not 50% of the soil bacteria have been classified. I shall request Feeble to research into this. They have access to our type of preparations, now also made in Italy, Switzerland, and France. What is the new dark humus substance in the soil made of after 1 year biodynamic transformation? With application of prepared 500 bacteria, enter the aired, moist soil. If all is undertaken correctly, these bacteria live only for moments, die, and new ones emerge. Thus a new substance arises from the dead bodies of bacteria. In arid Australia, where it generally is rather dry, especially in Western Australia, Soil at first is just poor sand, which is water repellent, like with powder, and drips run off. Symptomatically, this is an equivalent to the rock lumps ploughed up and shown in the picture of photograph A, which I will try to put up here. We have to wait for considerable rain. In main agricultural areas of Western Australia, soil moisture exists for only 3 or 4 months, until 500 can be effectively sprayed. Last May, we again visited Western Australian farms after an interval of some years, as I had to be in Europe so often. At Easter, relatively early, approximately 3 centimetres of rain had fallen. Our visit commenced 6 weeks later. The subclover had germinated. Over summer, everything green dies. Usually no rain for 8 months and very hot. On the conventional neighbouring farms, the subclover was dying. On our farms, it continued to grow. John Cashmore and some other farmers sprayed 500 immediately. Others waited for more reliable rainfall. Generally, for the amount of rain required when they first commenced 500 applications on their dead water-repellent soils. A bureaucratic act. We examined the soil profiles. The top 2 to 3 centimetres were dry. Below was a darker layer of 5 to 15 centimetres of visible moisture. The build-up of humus over the past years sucked in the rainwater, probably further down still, where it was not so obvious. In this moist region of warm soil, 500 performed wonderfully, and the clover grew well. We compared all biodynamic soils with those of conventional neighbours. The layer of moisture could be noted on all biodynamic soils. Also on those soils not yet sprayed with 500 this season, which now had to await later rains, when soil and climate would be colder and conditions less effective. The neighbouring soils were equally dry in the top 3 centimetres. Roots on top of the compacted lower zone were bent horizontally. No moisture was to be seen, and the subclover was dying. The faces of the newer farmers showed delight at their soil development. What developmental possibility arises therewith? A. The new humus layer holds water and enables prolonged soil biology and growth, as the pictures 11 and 12 show. Biodynamic pasture grows actively, whereas the conventional neighbours is drying up. B. Where the soil biology remains active longer and more new soil substance arises, experience shows that in the situation of deficiencies, phosphate in Australia, an application of 30 kilograms per hectare of rock phosphate is already too much, whereas 10 kilograms per hectare as medicine would be more suitable. Under conventional dead soil conditions, such insignificant amount would show no result. Because of the new humus quality and the continuation of soil moisture and enhanced soil biology, the 10 kilograms medicine we seldom do have to apply, activating extra clover growth, enhancing the biodynamic soil biology and enzymes, etc. activities, increases free nitrogen assimilation from the air, the fundamental substance for transmutation into other elements. In man's digestion, sugar can become fat and fat sugar. Our experience of decades does not make for any other explanation, i.e., according to monthly soil tests, the phosphorus would go up and down without any phosphorus being added. I will now show some pictures from Egypt. 2 years ago we visited Egypt. The major Nile Delta is widely known. For thousands of years, the Nile Delta soils have been farmed and enriched annually with runoff of organic substances from the Abyssinian mountains. On the account of the Aswan Dam, the Nile Delta now misses out on this flooding and fertilisation is required. The soil picture 16 was taken on a so-called biodynamic farm. Picture 16 shows lumps, irrigation, cracks and salt. Again, the colour is milky opaque. No soil structure is discernible. Nowhere did we find soil structure. After ploughing up the large lumps of soil, none of the usual crunches are required to break this soil down to dust, such as are required today even in the Ukraine, where the soils are so hardened that nowhere one could plough with horse or single moldboard plough, as in my childhood. One could not get the plough into such hardness, and, if it were possible to do so, one could not hold the plough down, and would be catapulted up and over. That is why today these huge tractors and murderous ploughs are used, even, as shown in picture 15 here, where after 1 year, biodynamic development with a good structure has been achieved. A giant tractor would recompact this fine structure immediately. Rob air penetration and new soil humus would begin to stink akin to the 500 in the airtight jar. We have developed totally new methods of soil cultivation, so that even with a 400 horsepower tractor and special cultivation implements, soil can be worked as caringly as with a fork in a vegetable garden. All such belongs to the biodynamic method, not just the preparations. And if compost is applied and it is left to dry out, the same musty smell develops as with the dried out 500 in this jar. Then destruction sets in. All this our farmers learn. But these Egyptian soils have run off the Abyssinian mountains in such small particles and form alluvial soils. Fine silt organic particles, not humus, and therefore structurally like sand. This soil settles and compacts without structure, and on initial ploughing similar large hard lumps occur. But because of silt particleness, these lumps melt during the customary flood irrigation like snow, and murderous declumpers are not required. One can discern this in picture 16. It also shows the absence of structure. On the still moist other half of picture 16, cracks are to be seen. I have never seen such on still moist soil, and the white powder on the top of the squares is a mixture of calcium and salt. Worldwide, especially in Australia, the salt problem is enormous. In Italy, we have seen early symptoms. In Western Australia alone, per hour, 4 hectares are lost to saltation. This is like a soil cancer, and nothing will grow anymore. To pacify the electorate, politicians before elections make promises of billions of dollars to counter the salt problem. However, these do not even understand the cause of the saltation, which has become more evident in the past 30 years. In biodynamics, we are the only ones who have overcome salt on such a large scale. Australia was once submerged in the sea. Salt is therefore inherent. In undisturbed locations, even in so-called deserts, the porous plants created and maintained some soil structure with pockets of air, passages, etc., provided drainage, and thus the salt remained harmless below the root zone. With increasingly destructive soil degradation by white man, with soil structure destroying ploughing, chemicals and heavy machinery, the natural structure was destroyed, compaction resulted, drainage was lost, capillary action of the sun raised the salt. In biodynamics, we recreated new soil structure, drainage recommences, salt is again washed deep down, and production returns. In Holland, Demeter International members were shown a biodynamic polder farm. This equally rich alluvial soil, not to be mistaken for humus, similar in black silt particleness like in Egypt, derives from the Swiss mountains. There was also similar lack of structure. A field planted to peas, showing earliest pod development, was already cracked wide enough for your hand and wrist to submerge. The following pictures, 17 and 18, shows a black soil of what today is a biodynamic farm, which adjoins some black soil of Agrilatina. According to the conventional analysis, this soil, in picture 17, is fully supplied with every major and minor element so far known. But an experienced farmer can discern in the picture that this 50 centimetre to 1 metre profile soil is sticky and would cause drainage problems for some vegetables. Originally, the soil was similar at the top. Worms are to be seen and stickiness. The colour also shows aspects of opaqueness. It should, like also the Egyptian soils, have a much darker glow. Latina was a huge swamp, drained by Mussolini. The next picture, 18, shows the same soil. The Arcangeli family reputedly produces the best leeks in Europe. For one, the soil, in picture 18, glows in its totally transformed structured blackness. Such I had expected to see in Egypt, and such could be achieved in Egypt if non-transubstantiated, dried-out preparations were not in use, as it is also in many other countries. It is not a question of moistening preparations again after they were dry, but whether they were transubstantiated and continuously held in the correct moist state. I repeat, I hold here in my hand 500, which scientifically has to be called transubstantiated. It achieves totally new darkening and structuring of soils without any organic substance being added. Transubstantiation is considered a sacramental happening. The reality of this is evident, and it is open to the cognition of anyone. Belief is not required, but cognition with independent objective consciousness of a perceptible reality. This is the Gotinistic method of cognition Steiner advocated. Objective consciousness, a consciousness soul activity. Whoever considers biodynamics can be practiced with non-substantiated preparations has not even begun. And someone who suggests that preparations are no longer required as long as one believes in Steiner's anthroposophy has never witnessed the effectiveness of preparations. This would amount to a negation of Steiner's impulse. Have animals individuality? Generally, anthroposophists say no, because Steiner indicated that animals have no ego incarnated. However, the possibility of an incarnated ego means no more than that those where ego is incarnated have the potential for further development. And one has to seriously question how often this really happens, and as to how many animals have far more individuality than many humans. Realistically, this question can only be put to people who work with animals. Whoever works with animals knows of the individual differences in animals. One milks 100 cows. 4 are quite different leaders. There are dogs. A child's mother has not yet noticed that the child has walked off and 2 kilometres distance is near drowning. The dog runs to the child and saves it. Such has been documented. Animals have individuality. Have plants individuality? Equally so. as such is demonstrated on an as yet unedited video, a pictorial representation, just as the new structuring of biodynamic soil is demonstrated, but of the upper plant biodynamic expression. Some of this can also be seen with Agrilatina plants. Plants also have individuality. Someone with 1,000 cherry trees recognizes exactly the 4 trees of similar background, which from beginning offered a better form, just above average size and with balanced fruiting every year. If the others have suffered in whatever way, the 4 do not. They are exceptions, and wood is taken from them for propagation. Considerable individuality exists. How is it possible that a new being comes to existence from 2 parents without being just a copy? Steiner also spoke of chaos in seed. Tests performed by the Biodynamic Research Institute demonstrate this further. Refer to Biodynamic Agriculture Introductory Lectures, Volume 1, pages 119 to 122. First, an example where no individuality came to development. We trained a tea plantation manager from Sri Lanka, highly cultured and educated also as an agronomist. He showed photographs, a hill covered with tea bushes. It appeared as boring as plastic bubble wrapping. In the Champagne exist similar examples of cloned vines. I asked what had occurred. This does not look like plants, but like stereotype repetitions. He answered, the whole hill stems from one plant. Tea belongs to the camellia family, from leaf cloning. For economic reasons, tea is planted this way in modern times. The tea bushes grow low and are easy to pick, whereas natural tea bushes were 2 to 3 meters tall and harvesting much more costly. Natural tea bushes, and historically also vines, grew in greater space amongst complementary plants, less monoculture. The soils are of rich volcanic origin, permitting deep taproots apart from shallow horizontals. The cloned small bushes have only the side roots and grow in tight rows without complementary plants. Therefore, large amounts of fertilizer have to be applied, whereas the natural plants do not require such. These unnatural plantations, however biodynamics may be practiced, would be unacceptable to us. We require that the plant is natural. On first visiting a newly converted farm, it has to be discovered what is physically wrong. This is not quite as bad as Dolly, the cloned sheep, which incidentally is aging over rapidly. The worst aspect of cloning or gene splicing is the avoidance of the chaos principle in enabling new individuality. Seed propagation must not be avoided. In this regard, it must be added how astonishing and illogical botany proceeds in declaring female and male parts within the flower. This distinction was taken over from the human and animal realm. Overlooked remains that are mating in the human-animal realm. The new being has inevitably started. Not so in the plant realm, where a seed can have lain 4,000 years in the coffin of a pharaoh, and only after being put into warm, moist, dark Mother Earth will a new plant emerge. The seed is the male part, and the female part is the earth. One of the scientific hypotheses, but detrimental to plant propagation when, eventually, in the hands of over-clever technical skills. We in biodynamics pursue plant breeding from the female pole and not solely from the male side. Important is that plants grow in the new soil developed by preparations, in humus-rich darkness, and to a state of new structure. That is, that plants are nourished via this new impulse. Thus seeds and plants become ongoingly healthier. Old quality varieties continue to be used, which conventionally have often had to be discarded. This also is biodynamic as distinct from organic. Organic suffers an underground insecurity and lives off the past, Old Testament-like, off runoff soils from mountains. Biodynamics is New Testament-like and impulses new soil. Jealousy and ambition exists everywhere, even in the anthroposophic society. Agriculture and humanity cannot for all future draw on resources stemming from erosion of mountains. This is not sustainable. Biodynamics is sustainable because new soil is created with, sometimes, minimal usage of old substances. Furthermore, old earth is dying, and so less and less old humus will eventually be available. In my book Active Perception, I demonstrate in methodical pictorialness how the biodynamic preparations, in particular 500, bring individuality forces. Steiner spoke of the individuality force of 500. Whereas I demonstrate objective perception and cognition in the area of individuality power in soil. With regard to these two pictures, 14 and 15, you should be able to see here, I often question not only as to where the dark substance originates, but also where does this astonishing new structure come from, and so quickly. One could say that this astonishing structure incarnated into soil. Spirit in matter. We are surrounded by this and nothing happens from nothing. Spirit gives structure. So also when one studies plants, where variations in growth expression can be demonstrated, Vincent van Gogh painted plants which rise actively. Rainer Sachs, the first to work in Switzerland as Agrolatina does in Italy, at my last visit, showed with arms and hands how his strawberries reached up like dancers and took me to them. True biodynamic plants show such uprightness. See picture 19, 20 and 21 here. Fundamental to Demeter registration in Australia is soil structure, which typifies and accompanies new soil formation. The further requirement is the described biodynamic upper plant expression. Our farmers see this uprightness. They might drive thousands of kilometres from home past wheat and see that it is biodynamic. They know nobody there, drive up to the house and see stirring machines, some of the new impulse of biodynamics. A chaos momentum takes place in the seed. Only thus a new plant arises. In man, this occurs during embryonic development, when the embryo, for several times, takes on form and dissolves again. In plants, roses, for instance, if propagated from cuttings, soon lose the rose scent and become roses without souls. How does one conceive a transforming, developmental future for Earth? Is it to be by another Big Bang? We begin by creating totally new soil and new plants, which look as though they were making eurythmy. For the whole of 1938, my twin sister and I were taken from the British boarding schools and stayed in a flat in Arlesheim and had private tuition from some leading former pupils of Steiner. Every morning we walked across the not yet built up meadows to the Göttenheim and often met Albert Steffen with his big rimmed black hat on his morning walk. Most important to me was that I had an absolutely free run of the Göttenheim. I could attend all performances and rehearsals. Most of the time I was up on the orchestra balcony and watched how Frau Steiner taught eurythmy and speech. The rehearsals were much more important to me than the performances. Such etheric eurythmy I have not seen again. Uprightness, power, forming, moving form. Like our plants stand in the formative force and the voice. We create new soil, scientifically explained and objectively visible, and we aid the plants, maybe more than animals, to advance. They have been left behind. Plants are pure as children, or, as one says, children as pure as plants. Animals also have great purity. That is known to those who work with them. In all this, one has to have observations. One has to have experience, or talk is of little sense. I regret that the Demeter International countries are not all represented by farmers, as is New Zealand by Ian, who knows unsentimentally what I am saying about plants and animals. Plants have not passion. Through biodynamics, they become new plants in uprightness. Such does not exist otherwise in nature. It is New Testament-like. If the preparations are not the appropriate quality, there may be 5 or 10% effectiveness. Our farmers would not wait for this. A healthy farmer wants to see results. Otherwise, there would only be belief, which does not belong to the consciousness soul age, the time of objective consciousness. Farmers in Italy who have attended my lectures for the first time in 1999 were reluctant to invite neighbours because they feared I would also give theoretical anthroposophic lectures, as had happened by others in the past. This deterred people. Such lectures were based in fixed theories and lacked in power of perception and objective consciousness, whereas what stems from perception widens and fills observations the practical farmers held beforehand. It explains as soon as it falls into place. The ill effect of such inappropriate, dilettantic theorizing to farmers and on the biodynamic movement is greatly paining. If I was able to make 3 laws, they would be: A, that only those are to own land who work it themselves. B, that everyone who is not a farmer, a mother with children, an independent tradesman, and the likes, would have to work with one of these for a month per year without weekends. Then feet would be grounded again and bureaucracy would reduce. C, that firms be limited to 150 employees. Steiner indicated that Pfeiffer, after absolving the exhaustive university program, could work 3 years at the institute and then should work 3 years on a farm so that the feet remained on solid earth. Pfeiffer, who did not come from the land, understood this. Thus, that after Steiner's death, he went to Loverendal Farms as manager, who never really undertakes hard yakka himself. For a while, Pfeiffer attempted to run a dairy farm in America, but had to give it up on account of sickness. I had hoped there would be a vessel in which we could hand stir, and please, Steiner spoke of stirring by hand, not with the hands, using a witch's broom. We, as with Pfeiffer, where smaller amounts are required, stir using our hands. There is a video on stirring. The first 500 was made on land of the Sonnenhof in Arlesheim. In 1938, that ground was still open. Today it is built on. When the first horns were to be taken out in the presence of Rudolf Steiner, they were difficult to find. Steiner became impatient and attempted to leave. The horns were found, and Steiner put his nose to one and expressed satisfaction. That says much. In my books, I described why stirring with a broom is counterproductive. Biodynamic reality and results depend upon all being performed at best. To obtain effective transubstantiated preparations, it is necessary that these, as in Arlesheim, undergo the process during the coldness of winter. In tropical conditions, cow manure is readily transformed into compost-like humus, but it has not the power of 500. We humans rise through a crisis situation, not when it is made easy. And then theoretical anthroposophists say nicely cosmic forces work in the 500 pit. Steiner did say you can speak of the etheric body if you can show why. All that is so claimed must be shown in practical, objective pictorialness. Here on Earth, we live on a planet which rotates and speeds through the universe. Before the first astronaut took photographs, I predicted that only the Earth body would appear in colour. Only Earth has water, air, light and warmth uptake. The glass in my hand can act as vessel for water. Were there no glass, the water would disperse. Our brain is not the producer of thoughts, but only the vessel in which thoughts appear. Artificially induced and measured electrical recordings in the brain are not identifiable with thought content. The Nobel Prize-winning brain physiologist John Eccles stated, and he did not use the smallest particle approach, but the holistic method. By taking identical twins, identical cells and neurons, with same upbringing and environment, one was highly developed and the other a dunce. Eccles took this to indicate that the brain acts only as vessel for that which he termed mind, which itself performs independently. Water in the air acts like a glass. It accommodates light. When it is humid on a morning with a totally clear sky, the light is overbright because of the heightened air moisture. A thunderstorm can be expected. Dry light is quite different. Flying at 12,000 kilometers, looking upwards, the sky looks dark. Downwards, it is lighter blue. Higher up, there is less moisture. The other planets do not have the extra 3 elements, only the solid. How cow manure is transformed in so short a period is miraculous, especially as this takes place in a coldness which denies bacterial activity. It is made difficult. What transubstantiates the manure? Scientifically, at the state of coldness, even frozenness to 1 meter, there is no explanation. It is by cosmic winter forces of Earth. The frozen winter soil has a suction power as, a little and materialistic example, the drag on a large concrete floor surface. When, in the still cold spring, the horns full of transubstantiated 500 are taken up. By the way, 500 is wrongly termed horn manure, perhaps because of lack of confidence such a conventional term is used. This 500 content is much colder to the hand than the horn or the surrounding soil, and if one lightly squeezes the horn-shaped 500 content, a crystalline breaking, crackling can be noticed. In a warm climate, compost is obtained. In the transformation, in adversity, the initial impulse of ego power is awakened. In the course, Steiner emphatically made 2 practical demands, that 500 is stirred energetically and that the crystal of 501 should be ground to finest flour-like powder. In a lecture, I demonstrate how the crystal substance, as light intake substantiality, is of old kind, akin to cow manure, and why it must be destroyed to powder, to a non-existence as substance, which can then serve to new light intake power. It therewith undergoes a transubstantiation equivalent to 500. The second ego empowering comes with energetic stirring interspersed by powerful chaos. This is discussed in more detail in my books and videos. Further to the obligatory replacement theory of elements, leaving the farm with produce. Everywhere exists Grandma's well-known backyard plum tree, with such especially tasty fruit, never cared for or manured, bearing fruit every year. Why do these fruits taste so good? Exactly because nothing is done to the tree. In the fibre comparative trial, I am informed that not manured plot produces, surpassed only by biodynamic, the best tasting products. Wonderful that, for once, notice is taken of taste. The consumer is more influenced by taste than of writing on a package. It is so because with this plum tree, everything of water-soluble elements taken up by the tree arises from natural humus, as in this case, this natural humus is the only supplier of water-soluble elements. In no other fashion have elements been supplied. In the Italian mountains exists many ages old natural olive trees, never manured or chemically treated, never irrigated, and they supply the best oil, finest quality, just as with the plum tree. Similar examples are provided by naturally functioning vineyards and herb gardens. The grapes taste like Granny's plum tree quality. Plants growing to century ages, olives, grapes, figs, can produce non-fertilized for long durations. There is also the example of huge natural archetypal forests, from which here and there have been harvested, and which continue on without any fertilization. However, in greatest diversity of species, i.e. not monoculture. But as stated today, with 4 times the population of 1900, we are responsible to supply huge cities and have to revert to monoculture. In consequence, Pasquale uses a variety of over 90 green manure plants. Each provides differingly. Only with the new biodynamic soil, nourished by the prior non-existence, New Testament-like humus, an even better taste than solely stemming from old humus is achieved. The large international firms Pasquale supplies seek, with contracted preference, Agri-Latina biodynamic quality. The Agri-Latina Demeter publication, which is not propaganda but truth and only works accordingly, reads almost poetically. Plants, daughters of the sun and earth, experiences of the cooperative Agri-Latina, a crisp and tasty carrot, a fresh inviting salad, a ripe and well-flavoured melon, light, taste, aroma, forms, colours, poetry, love, vitality, sun, quality, health, joy of life. The Australian market, even over distances of 3,000 or 4,000 kilometres, asks, when will certain peaches, avocados, cauliflowers, peas, apples, asparagus, bananas, etc. arrive at market this year? Consumers await these because the activity described by Pasquale is contained in these products. Then the Agri-Latina publication says, the beginning of enthusiasm, in spite of the considerable demands and sacrifices, has grown with gaining deeper insight into the mechanisms of life and with the professional application of the biodynamic method. Then reference is made to me and biodynamics in Australia, followed by practical scientific explanations. 90 to 100 workers supplying healthy food for 130,000 consumers. For years, weekly courses are held for the employees. All are informed and interested in biodynamic work and results, and undertake their work excellently. Now a scene from my video number 1, which, unfortunately, cannot be reproduced on slides. The first change from conventional to biodynamically enlivened soils is one of colour, of a purple tinge. Red basalt soils were originally not red, but more purple-brown. This humus has generally long been eroded in other countries. In Australia also exist such volcanic soils, which in the relatively short period, 200 years of white influence, have not been totally yellowed, and where in road cuttings the original purple colouring is still obvious. When we commence with a very dead yellow clay soil, then, before structure or black humus is formed, it is as though a purple hue was brushed into the yellow soil profile. In desiring to show the glow power of soils, where not only dark or blanched matters, a manifold palette would be required, including purple. Again, Van Gogh and Paula Modersohn-Becker were particularly cited and able to represent this. A further practical point to your visit to Agrilatina: when I was first taken to then 26-hectare Agrilatina glasshouse, it was by an anthroposophic advisor. He asked, "Can we accept such a large, unnatural glasshouse?" My answer was, "If we cannot face any agricultural situation and make a contribution, we do not represent an agricultural method." The soil was and can be seen with the neighbours' yellow sand. See picture 22. Earlier on, when Agrilatina was functioning organically, one annual green manuring crop, only one species, mustard, was used, followed by 3 or 4 crops. Mustard is stringy, lacking in real leaves, and not a legume. I suggested the use of at least 20 varieties. Today it is 2 green manure crops with over 90 varieties. I further suggested, after cultivation, to sow down the green manure, to irrigate no deeper than 10 centimetres, and to walk out prepared 500. This brings the plants up and is followed by a second 10 centimetre irrigation. The plants will come up to 20 centimetres high. This is followed by one very deep watering, easy to achieve in a sandy soil, which in turn then dries off from the top downwards. The roots, stimulated by prepared 500, follow the water deeper and deeper, and the 500 activity therewith acts and structures deep into the subsoil. After 4 weeks, the soil can thus be penetrated to 1 metre. It is easy to achieve soil transformation in the topsoil region, but we must strive for depth activity, also because of drainage, to accommodate the enormous amounts of rain mentioned earlier on. See also pictures 17 and 18. At the beginning of the lecture on compost, I said, the best is to not make any compost, even if of really developed colloidality, and, as usual, put into the topsoil, draws the roots to the enriched soil at the top. The effectiveness of sheet composting and what we achieve, especially with our dynamic rotational grazing management, works deep into the soil. Sheet composting also takes place when part of the farm is stocked, preferably with cows, sheep and others welcome, in rotation over the whole farm. Mixed pasture is offered at optimal growth, similar to the ideal time for harvesting lettuce, not too short and not too stagnated. During the first farm visit, we searched for the most suitable general farm method for the particular farm to function as a biodynamic farm, and therewith as a totality, for the applicable farm individuality suitable to the district, to achievability, to the physical and financial ability of the farmer, available machinery, apart from general biological and ecological requirements, etc. Essential is that animals, as much as possible, are outside. In Australia, that is so to 100%, even in snow. We have no stables, and that, for instance, in case of a dairy farm, the milking shed has one large concrete yard for in- and outgoing cows. In many areas of Earth, cows are mainly stabled. Grass is brought in today with huge compacting machines and is coughed out at the cows, who should be grazing and able to choose feed. In turn, the manure is spread out with equally compacting machines. Should any humus be left in the soil, so compacted it is robbed of air and stinks like the 500 bomb mentioned earlier. The typical European hay paddocks are of thin growth. The importance of the cow hoof pressure, as distinct from pugging, and the cow's grazing and breath on pasture for good sward development, well recognised by the Swiss peasant Hans Werner, has to be understood and provided for. With us, cows graze outside, but total rotation throughout the year is necessary. A dairy farm requires at least 20 well-fenced paddocks, which in size must match the herd number, so that in 10 days, with electric fence partitioning, paddock 1 is grazed off, just as if cut for hay. The herd is put onto the next paddock of optimum growth. The manure of paddock 1 must then be harrowed immediately. Manure is thus offered freshly to the biological activity of the soil, and twice per year prepared 500 is applied. 501 is used as plants require. Refer to the Biodynamic Agricultural Introductory Lectures, Volume 1. As little as possible should manure be lost on the cow tracks from paddock to milking shed. Cows are locked into their paddocks, and before cows are fetched for milking, they are calmly to drop their manure in the paddock. After milking, they are held half to 3/4 of an hour on the concrete, and the accumulated manure is bladed off to the side of the yard with a 4-wheeler motorbike, with a squeegee blade, and is covered with good quality hay for protection against the sun and rain. Thus, high quality material becomes available for compost making, made approximately fortnightly, fresh, moist, protected. We use compost spreaders for making and spreading the compost, which becomes an economic and easy task. Agri-Latina purchased an extra 100-cow dairy farm, mainly for compost reasons. Whilst for the first vegetable crop, the green manure suffices, later crops require additional compost for best colloidal quality. Good biodynamic compost acts dynamically like 500, with many years of effectiveness. But much more effective is sheet composting through dynamic rotational grazing and regrowth of pasture to optimal length, which makes for creation of deep root activity. On dairy farms, the accumulated manure has to be composted, with compost being applied on back paddocks or on very fertile farms is sold to market gardens. With rotational management, the entire farm increases in fertility, and in rotation, pastures can be cultivated and cropped without any outside manuring. Grain production is then nourished from newly established soil humus only. Grazing paddocks and hay paddocks are one and the same in turn. So no overgrazing and resultant shortening of roots or stagnation and thinning of pasture occurs.